you mentioned that it shouldn't be based on, because a lot of it is on historical emissions, and that reminded me of one of the scientists in environments, which said, if everything goes to zero today, nobody, emits anything, we're still there. It's not it's not like we're going back, right? We're taking back. And some scientists even describe the process of carbon emission that we observe today started 100 years ago, 200 years ago is the industrial revolution. So it built up over time. It's not like a
Yeah.
switch. So uh, a little bit, it's do you subscribe to this principle that we should start from today, not trying to rewrite or fix the history of industrialization?
Well, yes. So the Themis mechanism talks about what should we do now for future emissions, right? I also subscribe to the fact that well, industrialized countries have had the advantage that they have utilized this resource for free for a long time, and presumably this is a question that we also need to address. But I think the problem is that if we insist on coupling the two problems, then the historical problem, I think, is going to be very difficult to address. So I think it would be better for everyone, even the people who are not being treated fairly, if we only think about what's going to happen in the future. We must come up with a solution for the future now. And I don't think joining Themis shouldn't let you off the hook for your historical emissions. But I think we need to think about the problem separately because we urgently need to solve the forward-looking problem. And if we couple them, then things are going to get more complicated and potentially completely intractable. So I don't know how to solve the historical problem. My proposal is a solution for the one going forward, right? And I'm not saying that there isn't a historical problem. I'm saying there is one. I just think it's going to be very difficult to solve.
So two questions
Mhm.
on the back of a short answer, but question number one is not what the Paris Agreement is trying to do, mix the past with the future, in your opinion?
Yes, it's very hard to understand what the Paris Agreement really wants to do, right? So they are collecting funds, and the motivation for collecting the funds is that we have benefited, the industrialized countries have benefited, right? And they somehow owe it to the less developed countries, right? But the way it's done is not by saying, okay, you've benefited this much, therefore you need to give us this much, right? Uh, so climate reparations of that sort would be extremely difficult to negotiate, right? And it would involve astronomical sums, right? Because it would be essentially what has paid for the wealth of the wealthy nations, right? And and that's not what the Paris Agreement is trying to do, right? The Paris Agreement is trying to do something a little bit less, but it's not very explicit about what its motivation is or what its mechanisms are, right?
Uh, the sort of the model we bring to my mind is the sort of a free. I know you lived in Germany, autobahn, for instance, highway, and suddenly, day two comes and somebody puts the toll booths, and it said, okay, from now on you have to pay a toll. Doesn't matter that you didn't pay a toll for the last 100 years or whatever is the age of the autobahn, of the highway.
Yeah. So I think in practice, this would not really be implementable. I agree from a philosophical standpoint. I think it's a fair thing to ask for, but I think in practice, I think this can't be done.
Right, but the road needs now repairs, so if you continue to use it, you need to pay for the repairs.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
So you take a toll, a
Yeah.
tax on the road.
Yeah.
That's very, very interesting and very refreshing actually. And again, going to this idea of from macroeconomics, national level, to microeconomics of the individual level and the consumption and so on, and sort of aggregating that. And I think we have the technologies now at least to estimate this aggregation level, the average and so on, the mean of the consumption per individual,
Yeah.
right? So
So I think a
that's
lot of people are maybe a little bit frightened by the idea that you have to pay for using this resource, but I don't think there's anything wrong with it, except for the fact that historically we haven't done it, right? But when we started the Industrial Revolution, we of course thought the atmosphere was so big that it was effectively infinite, right? And we've now caught up with that, and we found that it's not actually effectively infinite, right? And we are running into a very real problem because it's not infinite.
well, it's a small infinity, right? It was infinite when we
Yeah,
started, right?
yeah,
Because the amount of emissions probably during the first industrial revolution were minimal. Actually, you reminded me also the fact that uh, using coal for heating, for home heating in UK was translated in a smoke tax.
yeah.
So, so there was at least a principle that you, not in this context, not with this body of scientific knowledge, not in this way, but was a concept that you're using a resource
Because of
and
local air quality, and local air quality is, of course, also a huge
was
problem
terrible,
globally. Yeah,
was terrible, was
yeah,
terrible, and that reminds me about, for instance, the uh, air quality in China, especially in Beijing, right? They got to the point that China was thinking of moving the capital. The problem of build so there are real problems that go from the macro level to the micro level of individuals. Individuals start to say, no, we cannot continue like that. So this is in support, I think, of the Themis mechanism. You know,
yeah.
there are pockets of understanding of we cannot continue like that.
I would agree.
So, uh, of course, if we talk about sustainability, we also talk about the sort of more um, activist part. I don't want to call it militant, but more activist part of people that uh, understand that we need to do something at the political and economic level. Is it an element in themes that connects with the activism, or it's something that the activists should really read and start to learn how to do it properly, or completely not properly?
Yes, but so I'm more a scientist than an activist. But I think when I look to the green movement, as I mentioned before, I think it's mostly a protest movement, right? And this movement, I think they're protesting for good reasons, right? But I also think that we need to grow up a little bit. We need to be for something. We need to say, well, this is the way we want to fix it.
Right.
And shockingly, I think if you look at the debate in the media, there isn't really a credible solution being put on the table. And so this is what how I see that I can sort of contribute here, right?
No, and you're absolutely right, and definitely you contribute, because this element of here and now, it's not in current. Allow me to say, we interviewed many people already, academics and practitioners and scientists and in climate and so on, and uh, we haven't noticed this. Let's start from here and now, move forward, propose a practical solution like the theme is, and then go back and in the history and see, if it's another way to look at the problem, but don't try to fix first or mix history with past, present, and future, let's say. So I think there is a lot in Themis, and that brings me to something you just said. This kind of initiative seems to be under the radar of media, media likes a protest, right? Because you film it, you see it, people have pancards or whatever. So it's visually enticing, right? As opposed to a paper, which, it's hard to uh, put it in
Yeah,
the media, right?
yeah. I think that's absolutely right, and I think I am talking to you today in part by trying to expose these ideas. Right, it's harder to sell uh, certain ideas than other ideas, but I think this is really what we have to do, right? And I think the idea, as you said initially, which I was very happy that I could explain you the idea in 5 minutes, right? So it's not horrendously complicated, right? And so this is another thing that I really dislike about the media coverage. They say, "Oh, climate change is so complicated that we can't really solve it." No, it's not. It's not that complicated. Like there are few principles, and if you understand them, then you can see, and then there's a way forward. It's also not intractable, right? I think there is a way to actually address these problems, right? And I'm I'm optimistic because I think there is a way. But as you point out, well, we need to sell it to people, right? We need to make people understand that there is actually
So
a possible positive way to address this problem, and
the,
that's not going to be easy.
on a different scale, on a different issue, but we're looking at how sustainability, and there is a commonality, if you allow me to say, with Themis, in a one way. As I described, we are looking at something called the sustainability transfer standard or model. And this is how you transfer sustainability across the supply chain. We're looking at the business part. And we found similar problems because businesses report individually on their objectives for sustainability. There is no mechanism to bring the main participants to their sustainability, right? So a company like, let's say, Microsoft says net zero by 2030. It's like, yes, but what happens with your AI data centers, for instance,
Yeah, yeah,
in terms of impact on the environment? So
yeah.
it's
So I think
and
the idea in the behind the Themis mechanism is, of course, that uh, you would pay for uh, you would have to pay for the release of CO2 wherever any good would be produced, but those goods who would take a lot of CO2 had a lot of embedded CO2 in them. They would then become more expensive, right? And then the end user would actually pay for it, right? And if substantial numbers of countries were members of the Themis mechanism, then you couldn't just send the production somewhere else, right? And so the mechanism itself actually encourages the end user, who's really the one who's causing the emission, to pay for it, even though the production extends over different countries, right? And so I think that's a
absolutely.
very important aspect as well.
And sort of as an example, is if you export aluminum, for instance, or cement.
Yep.
If you export that, you export actually a high level of um, use of electricity or heat, right?
Yep.
Electricity for aluminum. So in your product, actually 80% it's actually spent on. It depends on how you produce electricity, but most electricity is still
Yeah.
produced through fossil fuels today.
Yeah.
So ex
So the Themis mechanism would actually create a pressure against aluminium that was produced by using electricity from fossil fuels, right? And it would make that aluminium more expensive, as opposed to if there was an alternative way of producing it using, say, solar power, and that would help level the playing field, depending on what the price of CO2 emissions were, right? If they were high
right.
enough, then that would discourage use of CO2, independent of what the supply chain looked like, right?
Absolutely. And that
Yeah,
actually will produce an interesting macroeconomic change for companies because new companies do not need, back to your example, don't need to go through the history and produce first with fossil fuel electricity, then,
that's
first
right.
with
That's right. Yeah, and
with
there will be a
coal,
bigger
then gas,
incentive
then yes.
to do the
So
right thing. Yeah,
if there are, for instance, in the sun belt, right, they have lots of sun or wind, they can use directly this, and their aluminum will be cheaper because
Yep.
the economic cost will be. And to me, this is the central theme. Many times we have difficulties to put a price, a cost, cost and price being different, but putting a cost on the actually, as you said, using the atmosphere as a resource.
Yeah. So what I'm proposing, of course, is so an economist might say, well, we should find out what is the real cost of putting CO2 in the atmosphere and then set the cost to that. But I don't think you can do that because the real cost of putting CO2 in the atmosphere depends on which country you're living in. Like some countries are more susceptible to climate change than other ones are, and it also depends on what horizon you're thinking about. Are you thinking about this generation, or are you thinking about multiple generations into the future? So the real price of CO2 is actually not a real thing, right? And that's why I propose substituting this voting mechanism to try to establish a price which is that we come up with by democratic measures, right? It's because the real price doesn't actually really exist. So it's a proxy. It's the best thing we can do.
Sure, and actually, this real price, it's a problem if you look even at inflation and so on. Economists have different views basically on their models. There is
Yeah,
no
so it depends heavily on the discounting factor, which is the same as the length of and there are endless problems with that, right? So those things we don't have to agree on those. We can still agree on having a voting mechanism, and some people will vote for a higher price, and some people will vote for a lower price. Yeah.
what's important, what's really interesting. You have a unit of measurement, which is carbon footprint or greenhouse gases per person. So that unit of measurement, and I mentioned I'm an engineer. We always need units of measurements which are commonly agreeable, right? If I say a meter and you think it's 90 centimeters or a meter 10, then we cannot have anything working.
Yes. So I think that's really really true. And if somebody takes one thing away from this talk, I think the emission per capita emissions is sort of the sensible way of measuring things. It drives me nuts that the media keep saying that China is the biggest emitter. It's true, but it's also the biggest country. Like, and it's not the biggest per capita emitter, right? And that seems to be much more relevant.
So Luxembourg and Liechtenstein will be on the other end of the curve, right? Because they have or small countries, even.
Yeah, the size of the country, is not very important. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. We know that China and India are the biggest countries.
Right.
That's not the question, right? Yeah.
No, very, very important point. So again, this unit of measure is very important, and it's essential in establishing this mechanism, right?
So I would love that the COP meetings would start talking about emissions per capita, right? I think this would make it a lot more meaningful, right? Unfortunately, they haven't been very good at doing that so far.
And I don't know how accurate, because it's the first time I'm starting to think in this way, how accurate our current measurements of emission per capita are. We know that even at macro level, countries use some different metrics to measure the emission, right? So,
Yeah, so most fossil fuels are actually supplied by big centralized companies, and so I think we have it's relatively easy to measure how much coal and oil and gas is being produced, right? So I think those they're not completely accurate, those figures, right? But I think they're accurate enough that we could have a system that works way better than the system that pretends the atmosphere is free.
taking this as a unit of measurement, actually that will put the companies, major companies, in a competitive position, because we don't have way, right? We say, well, oil and gas emits more carbon footprint. Maybe on the unit of measurement, they don't. Compared to
Uh,
high-tech companies, right? Which use intensively energy and so on, and they do not account for the carbon footprint on the production of the energy, for instance, in detail. Anyway, I thought for the next talk, if we may. Uh, but really, you brought forward a number of interesting not only concepts but practical elements that we can move forward with sustainability. I would say the biggest benefit of today's talk is the fact that it is the simplification, is the ease of understanding. So now the question probably is to find people in media that say, yeah, I'm ready to listen to something that is simple, because the others are really complex. If you start to describe assumptions in a weather pattern mechanism and saying the weather today is because of carbon footprint, these are codependent
Yeah.
variables. You cannot really separate them.
I think that's absolutely crucial. I have a one sheet explanation of the Themis mechanism, and I think every good idea you should be able to more or less explain it on one sheet of paper, right? It's
We have also a monthly newsletter. Send it to me, please, and we'll give it space to the discuss to maybe triggers a discussion. Again, we don't need many people to start. We need few people that are motivated to start. And talking about few people and talking about the future, and um, it's uh, it's a question that always comes in our discussions. It's what advice would you give to students, and what advice you give to, and we deal in AK5 with many professionals that in the mid-career switch to sustainability, either through formal academic uh, training. I have students in Cornell in that category, it's adult students that take sustainability courses. So what advice you give to each of these two groups?
Yeah, so my advice would maybe be the same for both. That I think it's very important that we think about the big picture. We think about the framework. Uh, I'm always surprised that a lot of people who work on sustainability work on very small corners of the problem. And for some problems, I think that's entirely the appropriate thing to do. And I'm not sure, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think for sustainability and climate change, we have the urgent problem at the moment that we don't have a framework for how to put these things together. And that seems to be an overwhelming issue. And if we don't solve that, then making electric motors a little bit more efficient or all these things, won't really be enough, right? We really have to have a systematic way of thinking about this. Some people call it the system science. I like to call it. I like to talk about mechanisms, right? What is the sort of transaction that needs to take place? So I would very much encourage, both students and people who are switching to think about sustainability to actually think about the big picture, right? So, for example, some people say we should plant trees, and I love trees, right? And I also plant trees, but that's not going to be enough, and we know that it's not going to be enough, right? You can work that out on the back of an envelope, right? So we really need to think about things that will be enough, right? And that's what I call the big picture.
Right, and in the same time, I would say a big measurable. So I definitely encourage people that listen to us to uh, one pager shouldn't be too much, to at least dip their toes in the
That's certainly
water,
my
the way
hope.
they say.
Yeah, yeah,
And also the other element, which is probably equally important, is start with a framework.
yes,
We noticed too many times is the same thing with our efforts to talk about. You mentioned transactions, so sustainability has to be transactional for being captured by the current systems, economic, financial reporting, insurance industry, right? In finance, is the first sort of one to notice environmental changes.
yeah, yeah.
So they Well, I would like definitely to invite you back and definitely continue the conversation, not have a different conversation. And I would like also to thank you for taking the time today to visit with us, and for our audience to make sure that they tune in every week for a new episode of AKFI Actionable ESG Talk series, when we bring people that really can make a change to sustainability. That will give you new perspectives on how to mitigate risk and create value by integrating ESG and digital transformation, which is our purpose in AKFI. Again, thank you very much, Professor Rasmussen.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the great discussion.
Thank you.